Welcome inside to this edition of the Sunday Pod with Alex Garrett. As you know, I like to break up the talk show old ways of having the same faces on every station. Meet the Press, Face the Nation, all the big news talk shows on Sunday, and have voices that aren't being heard in the mainstream circuit heard right here. And one of them is actually a former White House speechwriter. You've heard him before. Michael Johns is back with us. Michael, you were the speechwriter under H.W. Bush, and now you're following Trump so closely. First of all, another great week of rallies. Give us your thoughts on the week that was with President Trump comparing to the Democrat debate.
Well, I think coming out of the failed impeachment effort, first, great to be back with you, Alex. He's had, probably two of the best weeks of his presidency. I think what's been clear is that his popularity among the American people has been stable. His favorable numbers are, in that 49, 50% range, which, by the way, a lot of people say, hey, that's really low, but pretty comparable to where Obama was, frankly. But unlike Obama, as you point out with these rallies, the supporters of Trump are hugely passionate. They're hugely engaged, like our Tea Party movement and kind of building, I think, on our Tea Party movement. He has brought people into the political process who have not felt really an avenue to, for expression or for engagement historically. So I have said repeatedly that I believe this man has saved the Republican Party, which was really starting to become more of a geographically centered party, strong in certain areas of the country, but completely irrelevant in others, and has, in so doing, I think, saved the country from what would have been 4 years of incredibly radicalized and highly politicized governance. I think his candidacy going into November looks very strong, but these are always very difficult elections for Republicans. I mean, you go through this electoral college math, which I've spent a good amount of time with, and it's you start out just challenged. You have 55 electoral votes in California, I believe. New York's at like 29, Illinois is at 20. That's from 80. You're over 104 just with those three states alone, which I don't hear anyone saying are really in play. But the good news for Trump is that his popularity in so many of these states have been historically considered swing states is immensely strong. So, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, these are states that I think he's poised to win. And I think that in winning that, the electoral college math and, in fact, surpassing his numbers from 2016 all come together.
We can't say it enough how not only has he brought people into the political process and just into the Republican Party, and I'm kind of mainstream, common sense, like, I don't identify as Republican or Democrat. I just say, what's the common sense goal here? And I think Trump finds that more so than any other on either side of the aisle, to be very honest with you. But he's brought in people who might be like me, independent, not affiliated with the party, but he has a message that's telling minorities, hey, you don't have to listen to what the Democrats are telling you. And as you know, I know we're friends on Facebook. I rollerblade in New York City on one leg. And so because I'm quote-unquote a minority, I think people wonder why I side with him, but it's because he's bringing everybody in with common sense ideas.
Yeah, all the way back into the 80s, the Republican Party had talked about its outreach into these communities, but it never really had a brand that resonated. Its actions never seemed to really match its rhetoric. I was critical throughout of that period that we were not doing enough, that this was absolutely illogical, that we would have sizable demographic blocks of our country that would just vote in unison for the Democrats who seemingly did very little for them. I mean, the cities they've managed are a complete mess, for instance. And, what I like about this president is I think he's put issues at the forefront of his policy agenda that were not really being previously discussed, that are central to the success of the American working class. So what he's done in addressing, which he's not done with yet, there's a lot of work yet to be done, but, in addressing immigration, which really no president has tackled in our adult lifetimes, about border security, overstayed visas, these illogical H-1B work visas that are used to displace American workers, outsourcing, and then obviously these incredibly flawed trade agreements that we've just allowed to sort of endure into perpetuity, and overhauling those. And then, doing what he can do to appeal directly to the African American community and address policies, not just rhetoric. I mean, the criminal justice reform initiative that he took is the most broad, sweeping, and influential criminal justice reform also of our adult lifetimes. And the statistical numbers from the standpoint of African American and Hispanic unemployment and wage growth are explosive, impressive, unprecedented. And so he has a very compelling record that he can communicate. And so it's not just a rhetorical appeal for these votes, but it's an actual communication of, here in 3 years are tangible things that I did with, oh, by the way, Democrats largely opposing me on every step, that to help you in your families and your respective challenges and issues.
Well, let me ask you, so, and you were a speechwriter, but see, I always say, I always believe that the disabled community and the communities of the minorities, instead of saying me, if you want to be part of the community, you have to think about the better of the country, don't you? That's just how I feel about it, and everybody else seems to think differently.
At some point, maybe it doesn't happen in our lifetimes, but at some point, the ultimate success in these areas will be that we stop talking about communities and we start talking in terms of how is the country doing, and that we're able to do that credibly because there is no disparity between what one ethnicity or one gender or any other demographic segment is doing. I think we've made progress in those areas, substantial progress in our lifetimes. The big issue continues to be, in my view, the issue of the American cities and the fact that they have proved to be so utterly failed on education, on employment, on economic productivity, on crime. They've really, in some cases, become absolute wastelands. And, the one thing, if you look at every one of these major urban areas that we're talking about, particularly the worst ones, the one common denominator throughout all of it is they've been governed for 30, 40, 50, 60 years by Democrats.
Right.
Now, so it's not just an issue of bad policies, but it's an issue of not having any political competition. So it's very easy for these incumbent Democrat mayors and city councils basically to stop even thinking that they're working for the people of their cities, and you get ingratiated in all of these fringe progressive ideas and things that have no tangible relevance to working people of their cities.
And, of course, inspiring everybody to work is a big thing in my playbook as well. Now, Michael, you were a speechwriter for HW. So tell me, in his speeches and his rallies, it seems that those behind President Trump are really doing a good job at sewing the message up for him to deliver, wouldn't you say? Speechwriters,
I think they've done a very good job, but a very unconventional job. I support the steps that he's taken. I mean, I think the idea of the traditional White House press conference was becoming increasingly absurd. They were just becoming opportunities for these obscure White House correspondents to engage in lengthy diatribes and confrontations with White House press secretaries, and not really designed to identify news, as it were, but to engage in opinion journalism. And I think that obviously, the biggest thing that's been talked about is that the president has communicating more directly with the American people probably than any president in our adult lifetimes in social media, and being able to express his opinions directly to them without the media filter. And well, that's disliked by some, including apparently some in his administration. I, for one, am a huge fan of it. I think it leaves, very obvious and clear what his positions are. I think it gets people closer to him, allows them to feel some proximity to what's going on in his mind and what he's thinking and what his direction is. And net, I think it's been a huge positive for him. So those are, we have a president who's more engaged in managing White House communications than a typical president has been. That's usually been, sort of outsourced to communications and media relations and speechwriting staffs, and they may be less formalized, I think, in this particular White House than they have been in traditional ones and previous ones.
And I think you and I laugh because they say, "Oh, no press availability." No, the guy's on the front lawn almost every day, talking to the media wherever he is, and it's that kind of direct contact. Look, no one had a problem with, fireside chats. No one had a problem with this. All of a sudden, this is a problem. I don't get the double standard here.
Yeah, it's a complete double standard, because when you look, Obama would do all these individual interviews with fairly obscure local markets, but, not a whole lot of White House press conferences. And when he did do those, they were not, really filled with inquisitive pressing or confrontational questioning. This president, is addressing the media pretty much, as you say, on a daily basis. He's been, I think, the most accessible president to media. And, there's not a lot of confusion really about where he stands on things. I mean, he's communicating that all the time directly through his own communications vehicles and then indirectly through media outlets. What's happened, though, and part of this is the blossoming and evolution of American media, and part of it is Trump's particular style, is that the traditional monopoly that the major media White House press corps has had on communications related to the president has been diminished, and that has been pretty aggravating to them.
And it has.
There's been a sense of entitlement, frankly.
And of course, because they were entitled to know he was going to Afghanistan. He couldn't surprise the troops on Thanksgiving. Like, this is how insane it's gotten, to be honest with you. And I knew there was going to be a very big bias amongst the media when the crowd sizes at the inauguration was the first big issue they took to task in the presidency. Meanwhile, for 4 years, they didn't even ask follow-ups about the Iran deal. So you knew when they were focusing on a minute issue, but we're not pushing back on Obama's press secretary, Josh Earnest. You knew there was going to be some problems given by the media this term.
Yeah, I mean, it was. I haven't seen any formal studies of this, but that first 24 hours, if you compared coverage to the content of his inauguration speech, which was filled with a lot of substance about what he was committing to do for the country, to the discrepancy over how many people were actually there. And let's just face it was packed. I don't know the exact number. And this has always been an issue. It's been an issue with rallies I've spoken at in D.C. too. They're not particularly good at estimating crowd sizes formally, but it almost doesn't matter. It was a very, very packed day. I was in Washington D.C. that day for that, and that entire mall area was filled with people.
And it was, and they will be again, I believe, less than a year from now. And now I got to ask you this. So not only the inauguration, but then this year, Pelosi rips up the speech. Now, you guys take a lot of time to make those speeches happen and craft them and whatnot. and she just ripped it up. And I'm sure as a former speechwriter at the White House, you were very ticked off, and as an American, you were ticked off at that.
Yeah, absolutely, because, it was, and it just showed, I think, the desperation and rage that characterizes the modern Democrat Party. There were so many components of that very well done State of the Union speech that, I think should have been embraced by Pelosi and congressional Democrats. And it was a sign of immense respect both to the president, more importantly to the presidency, and to the process that's existed. So, and I think it was also a disservice to the many individuals who the president correctly highlighted
right
in that, in that speech. I think of Stephanie and Jamia Davis, the Philadelphia student who was seeking the tax credit for the scholarship, and Juan Guaido, the opposition leader who's the de facto legitimate president of Venezuela,
right,
who had been there, and the Army Staff Sergeant,
the 100-year-old Tuskegee Airman. I mean, all these different stories that were highlighted.
Halsami, absolutely, great example. The Tuskegee Airman. It was just Rush Limbaugh, obviously facing a serious cancer diagnosis, and that's the whole totality of that approach just seemed to me to be very disrespectful and very unbecoming, and I can't imagine that it was well received by any centrist voter in the country.
I would think not. Now, yesterday, this is going to air on Sunday, so yesterday talked with a Franciscan brother who was singing to the homeless here in New York, very positive, very spiritual, and we didn't bring up Trump, but I just feel like everybody always says, Michael, let's look at the bright side of life. Well, the minute you try and mention Trump, they don't see a bright side. What is their issue? Why can't they acknowledge one good thing he's done?
Because I think he is, as I think our Tea Party movement has, broken down some of the power paradigms within modern progressivism in the Democrat Party, which frankly haven't delivered for the American people. We very patiently gave Obama 8 years. He couldn't produce 1 year of 3% GDP growth. His job creation was hugely unimpressive. Our trade deficits rose on his watch. Our national debt doubled on his watch. Every metric through which you would have assessed the success or failure of his presidency more or less ended up in worse condition than it was before it started. And so I think along comes this very unconventional political figure who resonates with what has historically been part of their base, particularly working Americans, union workers, people who work with their hands, blue-collar workers, vastly, as you pointed out, growing numbers of African Americans and Hispanics. Trump did better with those communities than either Romney or McCain did, and I think he's going to do better in 2020 than he did in 2016, perhaps sizably better. They're looking at it, as they always look at it, exclusively from a political perspective of saying, geez, he is eroding our historical political constituency, and how do we survive this? And by the way, this is basically the problem. I'm not trying to just pinpoint this on Democrats, because it's existed within the Republican Party establishment too. It's like, how do we get beyond this issue of one party winning, one party losing, and start getting public servants, politically elected individuals, political constituencies to celebrate American victories and to rally the country behind addressing its challenges. And I think Trump, to a large extent, has done that. We forget, because it's been a few years, but not too long. But if you look at the candidacy in the primary that he ran in 2016, and I endorsed him, as you know, on day one, June 16, 2015, he ran against the Republican Party establishment. His victory in that primary and ultimately securing the Republican Party nomination was a victory over the Republican Party, not by the Republican Party. And so he's been a transformative political figure, in my judgment, certainly the most influential Republican since Reagan, and increasingly an argument can be made that he's been even more influential than that.
Well, yeah, and as you're talking, I was also wondering your thoughts on the on-the-ground Democrat that seems to eat up everything the media is saying. How did the media get the regulars, the everyday people, to just be miserable every day? It's really sad to see.
Yeah, well, I think I started my heavy-duty political engagement in the 1980s when the economy was struggling in a lot of respects, but if you compared it to where it was in the late 70s with stagflation or Jimmy Carter, it was moving generally in a positive direction. Inflation was coming down, unemployment was coming down, the country was starting to get its footing back. And at the inclination of the major media, and this was back in the 3 network days, was always to sort of find and highlight these individual cases of people struggling. Well, no one denied that those cases existed, but the broader trend of the economy was completely ignored. Here again, I think this is the case, but they're finding it increasingly difficult to identify examples where we've had, a country that is moving pretty closely toward full employment. And not just that, but for the first time really since the turn of the century, we're seeing impressive movement in wages, which, by the way, is a product of starting to control immigration, and trying to essentially offer working Americans an opportunity by not over-flooding our country with surplus labor. And I had these Gallup numbers. These are now a couple weeks ago, but if you look at some of these figures, this is January 17th to January 20th, the movement of the American people and their viewpoint about the direction of the country is overwhelmingly positive. The economy, their viewpoint on the economy was in January 17, when Trump came in, was 46% positive. It's now 68% positive. That's a 22-point leap. Wow. How we're addressing terrorism on a global and domestic level was 50% positive when Obama left. It's now 68% positive under Trump. Military preparedness, 66% positive January 17, up to 81% positive today. That's a 15-point lead. And here's one that really impressed me, was race relations. We're routinely told by mainstream media that somehow this president is alienating or combative president who is increasing racial tensions in the country. Just the opposite, according to the perspective of the American people. Only 22% of American people had a positive feeling about race relations in the country when Obama left, despite all of the rhetoric of what he said he was going to do back in 2008, despite the beer summits and all of these symbolic things. Only, a little over 1 in 5 people felt positively about it. That's jumped to 36%, still entirely too low in my judgment, but that's a 14-point leap on President Trump's watch in how the American people perceive race relations in the country. The American people believe race relations in this country are improving on President Trump's watch, period. That's factual. That's documented. That's the most respected polling agency in the world.
Well, and those polls will continue. By the way, the one you mentioned where he had that jump after impeachment, 38 to 44, that was a Washington Post. I say it correctly. Washington Post poll. So even those that follow the Post seem to be thinking Trump's been doing pretty good here the last couple months. Now, Michael, I wanted to play you this other, because in addition to the economic growth, the killing of terrorists, he's really tapped into one other frustration I think Americans are having, where bureaucrats are telling us what to do. And you remember the Eddie Gallagher case? After that, Trump did this, and he said this at the rally following Eddie Gallagher, and I think you'll appreciate it, and I think you'll understand, and maybe the listeners will more so, that this is why Trump won in 2016.
People can sit there in air-conditioned offices and complain, but you know what? Doesn't matter to me whatsoever.
And so, I don't know if you heard that clearly, but he's saying these bureaucrats who sit upstairs in air-conditioned offices, they don't matter to me. And that's what the American people really voted him for, because they saw the waste that was going on in each department, and Trump's vow to get rid of that waste.
Yeah, so I mean, my reaction there, it's kind of twofold. I mean, on the positive side, and it's a huge positive, he's correct. He's absolutely right about that. Many of these individuals, I can remember being a political appointee in the Bush administration. You would have career officials who literally did nothing, and then you would have to have political appointees who would basically watch these individuals who everyone knew were doing nothing just to make sure they didn't do anything that was hugely dangerous or damaging to the administration and to our federal government. Now, let me be objective about it. Because has everything been perfect the last 3 years in this administration? It hasn't. One of the things, and it is the biggest thing in my judgment, that this president's got to get his arms around, is the fact that as great as his vision is and as great as his personal capabilities are, as unmatched as they are, meaning if you're going to negotiate a deal or something like that, he's the guy you would send into the room. If you're going to communicate a message, he's the guy I'd feel most comfortable doing it. Despite all those facts, it takes an entire federal government aligned with your agenda to be successful. And when you put into an administration individuals who were very outspoken and engaged in opposing your candidacy during the primary, or individuals who historically have been part of the very swamp you're trying to drain, or you leave vacancies, or you leave, worst case scenario, Obama holdovers who have a completely contradictory agenda, you're going to hit a lot of bumps in the road, and you're going to hit a lot of roadblocks in advancing your agenda. And I think from the leaks to the some of the representation he's received in these legal cases with, I don't think, necessarily federal attorneys arguing these cases with sufficient diligence or passion because they themselves don't believe in it, to individuals who have done very little to think of and support in creative ways opportunities to advance his agenda. This administration, 3 years into it, continues to be largely filled with a lot of these individuals. And I think, just on the Director of National Intelligence appointment this past week, following it and starting to say, well, maybe he's starting to get his arms around the fact that this really takes an army of individuals in your administration. I mean, when in the Bush 41 administration, the day of Clinton's inauguration, everyone knew it was time to go. I don't even recall there being much of a conversation about it. I mean, every political appointee that was appointed by President Bush left the federal government that day. When Obama arrived, every George W. Bush appointee knew it was time to go for the most part.
Right.
This is the only administration that kind of let a lot of these guys hang around. A lot of them are still there in major policy-making positions.
We make a lot about the Midnight Massacre, where they, Thomas Jefferson, I think, or whatever, they left the night before, before midnight or whatever. We all thought that was a bad thing. Now we think it's a good thing, and I kind of like that change.
Well, the whole Ukraine impeachment effort, and in a lot of respects, the Russia impeachment effort too, when you really break down and say, hey, what was behind this whole thing? Because we had an entire Mueller investigation, over $30 million, a couple dozen highly politicized Hillary Clinton-aligned attorneys who, 2 years into it, conclude there was no collusion between the campaign and Russia after distracting the country with the proposition that there likely was or could have been, and the Ukraine thing, which amounted to really nothing. We didn't hold up the aid to Ukraine. Ukraine never did any favors for the president, or never delivered on any of these investigations that were speculated about. We still don't know what Hunter Biden was doing with this company, Burisma, for the most part. So what was the basis of all of them? Basis of all of them were individuals in this administration, particularly in intelligence and national security functional roles, who were Obama holdovers still in the administration, who were raising these objections internally and were sophisticated enough to know how to navigate the federal government, including involving the Department of Justice, including involving the whistleblower process, to call national attention to two things they presented as being both criminal, impeachable, and even traitorous that amounted to nothing.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And yet there's still not been accountability for those individuals.
And by the way, Michael, what I'm trying to get through my audience is that, and maybe you can help me, is that, hey guys, your party also enlisted foreign intelligence against Trump. So you're just the pot calling the kettle black.
Exactly. Well, it's not also. It's primarily that's what happened. I mean, both of these cases were examples of, I think, in what psychiatry you call projectionism, which is attributing to someone else the very attributes that you know are inherent in yourself. So we allege, or the allegation is made, that Trump's campaign is colluding with Russia, when in fact it was Hillary Clinton's campaign that went over, retained a British intelligence official to go to Russia to put together this fake dossier, then to leak it to media and hand it to the Department of Justice and initiate this entire investigation. That's essentially what happened. Well, if that's not Russian collusion and Russian engagement in this electoral process, I don't know what is. I mean, if it were not for Russia's engagement in this investigation, the investigation itself would never have been launched. It was on that basis that the Carter Page surveillance warrant was actually issued. So you say that's Russia. Yep, Russia was, a force, but it was a force on Hillary Clinton's side, utilized by Hillary Clinton personnel. Then you go to Ukraine, and you take just that speech alone that Joe Biden gave at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he talks about terminating the prosecutor that at the time had begun an investigation into his son Hunter Biden's affiliation with Burisma and to several other components of Burisma's corruption, and him boasting that he went over there and said he was not going to release this aid until that prosecutor was fired. And, sure enough, as he says, they fired him.
And the idea,
that's not even conjecture. That is like right there on the record for anyone who wants to reveal it. And there's a lot of speculation, and I tend to agree with it, that the Ukraine investigation was designed not just to put the president on defense, but to prevent this Justice Department and this administration from beginning to do the logical work of saying, hey, what did occur here? And was there criminal activity, or was there an undue level of pressure and a quid pro quo exerted by the Obama administration, not by the Trump administration?
Right. And to top that off, so yeah, the reasoning is they gave was because he was a corrupt prosecutor. So you wanted a prosecutor to come in to actually investigate your son. The whole logic they tried to defend that was ridiculous. It just was bizarre to me.
Well, I still think the question remains unanswered. And why is it unanswered? It's unanswered because once you put the president on the defense on the very issue that warranted investigation, it looks incredibly defensive and combative to come back and make the same allegation of, the people that are making it. And I think, so to an extent, the progressive left in this government is and continues to be a tad bit more politically sophisticated than our Make America Great and Tea Party movements have been in tactics. They have no ideas on policy, in my judgment. They have no real solutions for this country. They've been afforded the opportunity to try to solve some of these problems, and they've been universally unsuccessful. But what they are very good at is working the machinations of the federal government and both destabilizing and stalling initiatives that are counter to what the American people want and to what this president wants. And just finally, I mean, I pointed this out a few times. I think I was one of the few people to do this, but I actually, we went through all of that Ukraine investigation, Alex, and I wanted to I made a decision. I said, let me look at it dispassionately, okay, because I'm a Trump loyalist, I'll be honest. Day one, like I said, supporter, endorsed his presidency. I've defended him in some of the most bleak moments because I believe he's what our country needs. Mm-hmm. I said, let me just look at it without any political lens on and see, is there anything that adds up here? And I started to look at, most of the witnesses that they called were in that closed door basement where they issued depositions, and most of those depositions never saw the light of day. Trump wasn't allowed to call any of his own witnesses. They weren't allowed to be questioned with with Republicans. So it was a one-way conversation. But then when you look at the public dimension of it, and you say, well, who do they actually bring forward to make this case? I started to go through it. Ambassador Taylor, who was the ambassador to Ukraine, said he could not identify an impeachable offense. Yet George Kent, he's the deputy assistant secretary, I believe, for Europe and Eurasia, said he never spoke with the president of the United States. These are the people they're bringing forward. It's Fiona Hill from the NSC.
Right.
Said couldn't recall Trump ever saying anything to her about Ukraine aid or anything related to it. You had David Hale, who's one of the most important political figures in the State Department, Undersecretary for Political Affairs, said he was unaware of any nefarious activities in the Ukraine dealings. This Colonel Vinaman, who was like their main star witness, all right, who's subsequently been reassigned within the government, correctly reassigned, should have been reassigned on day one, in my view. Because when we really dug down to what was the basis of his objections, it looked to me like he didn't feel the president had any role involved in his issue of Ukraine. But even with what he said there's no basis for any allegation of bribery, which would rise to high crime and misdemeanor. Yet Ambassador Volker, who was the ambassador to NATO, clearly said 4 words: there was no quid pro quo.
Right.
And then the one witness, finally, that I thought held any credibility, because he was actually on the call, Tim Morrison from the NSC, who handled Russia and some European-related security issues, said, I was on the call and there was nothing wrong. So you have, on the fact witnesses alone, if this were, say, a criminal case, just nothing that adds up to anything. This would be dismissed on summary judgment in any court of law. And then, of course, the 4 facts that are indisputable. Number one, Adam Schiff gets up and misrepresents the nature of the call between President Zelensky and President Trump.
Right.
And the president, to his great credit, calls him on it and releases the transcript. Nowhere in there is anything that is even suggestive of a quid pro quo. The media question Zelensky and say, hey, was there any quid pro quo? He says no. Trump says no. Then you have the aid released. They say, well, the aid was delayed, but it was released within the time frame allocated.
Right.
And then finally, you have, as I pointed out, this issue of, well, what did Ukraine do to get the aid? It turns out nothing.
No,
I mean, really, just an absolute national distraction about a non-existent scandal. And sadly, we have to allocate, as you and I are doing right now, time to defending the President of the United States on this issue at the expense of advancing his agenda. It's been an immense disservice to the country over the last 3 years, and I hope every Republican who goes back to their district, whether they're challenging or running for re-election, is going to point out that these do-nothing Democrats have had nothing on their mind the last 2 years but obstruction, resistance, and trying to sell this impeachment lie to the American people.
Michael, where can people get this rundown of the Ukraine testimonies? Did you put it in writing? Where can they find it? I
ought to put it in writing. That's a good suggestion. Let me take that to note. I think that's that's worthwhile. I had to probably put some article on this before it's the whole thing's swept into the dustbin of history. But these core witnesses, these are Democrats who brought them forward. These weren't witnesses for our side. None of it added up to anything. And you just saw Schiff sit there throughout all of it. And I could go on with it. I mean, remember, he promised repeatedly, we're going to hear from the whistleblower. You'll hear from the whistleblower. Then all of a sudden, the hearing starts, and he says, well, I don't know who the whistleblower is. And of course,
that was
we
a
all
lie.
kind of knew we know who the whistleblower was. Not only do we know who the whistleblower was, but we know the whistleblower had a history of partisan engagement with Biden and with congressional Democrats, and had met with Schiff's office. Schiff really has been, I think, throughout this whole thing, one of the most disturbing figures. And most concerning to me is you could take a lot of the comments he said in isolation, particularly during the Russia investigation, when he said he had indisputable evidence that he had reviewed that showed there was no doubt collusion between the Trump campaign and the government of Russia in the 2016 election.
Right.
I heard that. Even I heard that. And I said, wow, I'm not reviewing the classified material that he's reviewing. I can't sort of wait to see what this is. I always had in my mind that he was politically spinning it. It wasn't politically spinning it. It was completely contrived.
Right.
And to have a senior member of, a ranking member on a House Intelligence Committee like that come forward and lie to the American people. And even to this day, no one really circles back with him and says, well, what were you talking about?
My suggestion
It's all over now. It's all over. It's all over now. There's no need to conceal any facts. You said you had this information. What was it? Because we had the highest level, most granularly detailed investigation into this president on this issue that you could ever have imagined. Millions of documents produced, dozens upon dozens of individuals involved, interviewed under oath, and even individuals put into cooperation agreements with the federal government on it, and they had factual, indisputable conclusion that there was nothing to it. So what was he talking about? And what were these other, congressional Democrats talking about? What was Pelosi talking about? I think they need to be held accountable to the fact that they misrepresented to the people they serve, the American people, what actually was transpiring.
And Michael, I would say Adam Schiff should just have stuck to being a screenwriter in Hollywood. That would have been a better job for him, in my opinion. Now, one last thought on all the weekend. Nevada happened, and I don't even know how important that caucus is for this, but I do know this. Just know that 1,000 votes were already voided before the voting even started. Michael, I just think they're rigging it one step at a time, and they don't want to admit it.
Well, people have different views on these caucuses. Nevada, of course, is a caucus state like Iowa was. The Iowa caucus was fundamentally flawed in a whole bunch of respects. And by the way, it wasn't a particularly complicated undertaking. We asked the Democrat Party of Iowa to count, I think what ultimately was under 200,000 votes throughout the state. And they couldn't do it in a timely and accurate fashion. And now you have these questions that are already emerging on the Nevada caucus. And I think it's going to ultimately prove to be the end of the caucuses if you're not able to resolve this. And a lot of people think that's probably a good idea. But, there is kind of a role for the caucus historically in American democracy. I mean, it shows a lot of grassroots organization. I've always liked that about Iowa, that you can't go in, for instance, in that first primary state and just blow the state up with statewide television ads and win. You've got to get around that state, and you got to meet and get to know voters. And it's a very large state with a very diverse range of issues that it's confronting. And that always gives candidates like real roll up your sleeves engagement in actual democracy, in my viewpoint. And, in Nevada now you have these processes being called into question. And I think ultimately it's going to turn around and say, that we can't do these caucuses. We need a more traditional voting approach. And then, of course, the bigger concern beneath all of it is we continue to have a Democrat National Committee that absolutely despises Bernie Sanders, does not want him as at the head of the ticket, believes he's going to be completely destructive for down ballot votes for congressional Democrats, and set aside the fact of whether that's true or not true. The role of the Democrat National Committee is not to be taking the place of Democrat primary voters and determining who the nominee is. In a lot of respects, particularly in allowing Hillary Clinton to lend all that money to the DNC in the 2016 election, and now again in the way they're handling the 2020 primary, it appears that they are not. Yeah, I mean, making the rules to allow Bloomberg to appear in that Las Vegas debate the other night. Just for starters, as one of a whole series of examples that are emerging, it's clear that they are prepared to change their rules at any given moment to allow what is politically expeditious or politically convenient to them in achieving what they want to achieve, which, is maintaining the status quo. That's why I've put out, and I've commented on this in the last few weeks, that as much as I really don't buy into one part of Ocasio-Cortez's political agenda for the country, I'm as big of an opponent as can be. The idea that she's putting forward of being able to challenge some of these Democrats in primaries, which Pelosi really disapproves of, is really healthy for the Democratic political process. In my viewpoint, the best way to defeat socialists is to have more socialists out there talking about what they want to do to the country so we can understand it, And the more the American people hear Bernie Sanders talk about this agenda, I think the more skeptical they're going to be. I think the Democrat National Committee knows that as well, which is why they've been utilizing every lever of power available to them to attempt to stop his candidacy. And if I were a Sanders supporter, I would be outraged with that. Now, I would look for constructive ways to change it. For instance, I would get more involved in the party and have the grassroots more involved in the party so that these things can't happen. In part, that's what's happened here, is that the Sanders campaign have organized outside of the traditional apparatuses of the Democratic Party, much like our Tea Party movement organized largely outside of the formal organizational role of the Republican Party, and attempted to influence it. But the direction that they've taken in clearly bringing their biases to this primary are really appalling. And I would be very, very disappointed if I were a registered Democrat in this country with the way they've managed it.
Well, I got to be honest, I love asking the questions, teeing it up, and then you just laying it all out for us, because I feel like we don't get that full picture anymore, and we have to. So, Michael Johns, where can we follow you on Twitter?
Follow me on Twitter at my name, one word, Michael Johns, and on Facebook at Michael Johns Tea Party.
And this might be a weird left field question, but to close up my weekend and then staying sort of on topic of spirituality, don't you feel in a way this presidency has a spiritual component behind it? I feel like it does.
I agree with you completely, Alex. I believe it does. I think the odds that this president beat back in 2016 required a lot more than an individual or even a movement. I believe that for all the personal flaws that one might want to point out about this man, I think he has a heart on the issues that really matter, on religious liberty, on defense of unborn life, that are as strong-willed as any president in our lifetimes. And I think that he is advancing a culture of that. And rhetorically, it's very pleasing to hear from him repeatedly say that our rights come from God, they don't come from government. That is a principle our founders were very adamant about. It was a principle the National Tea Party movement's been very adamant about. And I believe it's one this president in his governance has continued to communicate to the American people. And if you don't understand that one founding principle, and you believe that our rights come from government, a government that can give rights can take rights away, it creates a whole series of very unappealing conclusions about the role of government in our lives. So I think this president's done a great job both in his actions and rhetorically in communicating the foundation of our liberty coming from a divine source.
Amen to that. And it is Sunday, so thank you so much for that little wisdom and for clarifying that for those who may not be thinking so clearly. So, Michael, thank you so much, and we will talk to you soon.
Great talking to you again, Alex. Take care.
Thank you. I'm Alexander Garrett. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you soon.